The Pacific Ocean in 1942 was an endless graveyard of blue, scattered islands, hidden reefs. A war that swallowed everything. For the United States Navy, the early months of the Pacific Campaign had been brutal. Pearl Harbor still burned in memory. Wake Island was lost. The Philippines had fallen. Every mile westward seemed paid for in blood and steel. But the American strategy depended on one crucial factor: air power. To fight across an ocean the size of half the globe, the Navy needed runways. And runways meant land. The problem: there wasn't enough of it. Most islands were either Japanese strongholds or barren rocks barely above sea level. Every traditional military engineer agreed, without firm soil, without real ground, no airfield could exist. And yet, a radical idea began to take shape. What if the Americans could carve a runway out of nothing? What if a reef, jagged and hostile, could be transformed into an airbase in less than 2 days? The Japanese considered it impossible. The US Navy wasn't so sure. By mid-1942, desperation forced commanders to gamble. Every delay meant Japanese bombers controlled the skies. Every hesitation meant convoys would be ambushed. An audacious plan was formed: send the Navy's new CBs, construction battalions of engineers, carpenters, welders and bulldozer operators, to build an airfield in record time. But not on a lush island, not on volcanic soil, on a reef, a place the enemy dismissed as worthless. The men who received the orders knew the odds. They knew the reef lay exposed, open to enemy bombers. They knew the Japanese air patrols scanned those waters constantly. They also knew one other thing: they had just 48 hours. What followed would shock the enemy and reshape the war. At first glance, the reef looked like a cruel joke. Half-submerged, lashed by waves, sharp coral everywhere. To the untrained eye, it was uninhabitable. A dead space in the middle of the ocean. Even American officers doubted its potential. Some thought the plan bordered on insanity. How could you flatten rock, drain water and build a 3,000-foot strip where even walking barefoot cut skin to ribbons? But its position, that was the secret. The reef sat within striking distance of key Japanese supply routes. From there, fighters and bombers could protect convoys, raid enemy garrisons, and extend America's reach deeper into the Pacific. Location was everything. If an airstrip could rise from this reef, it would give the United States a stepping stone the Japanese had overlooked, and the Japanese had overlooked it. Reconnaissance planes flew over, but saw only white surf, coral ridges, and no vegetation. To their eyes, it was worthless. No fresh water, no shelter, no natural harbor. Why would anyone waste time here? That blindness was America's advantage. In June 1942, the Seabees arrived. Their landing was anything but glamorous. Small craft bumped against jagged coral, men waded through surf, hauling crates, engines, barrels of fuel. Bulldozers, their most precious weapons, were offloaded like beasts into the sea, dragged across planks, engines coughing salt water. To the men, the reef felt hostile. The sun burned like fire. The coral cut through boots. And yet, orders were orders. One CB later recalled, it wasn't an island, it was a rock. And they told us, boys, this is where you'll make the impossible. They wasted no time. Survey crews marked the flattest stretch of coral. Explosives were prepared to blast ridges. Bulldozer blades dropped into jagged stone, but the clock was already ticking. Everyone knew Japanese reconnaissance could appear at any moment. If bombers arrived before the runway was ready, hundreds of men and every machine would be annihilated on the open reef. Still, the gamble continued. The Seabees weren't regular soldiers. They were skilled workers, many of them older than the average Marine. Carpenters who had built houses, steelworkers who had raised skyscrapers, men who knew how to solve problems with grit and ingenuity. And now, in the middle of the Pacific, they had one order: build an airstrip in 48 hours. Or die trying. The reef echoed with the thunder of machinery. Engines roared. Steel clashed against coral. The Seabees had come prepared for a fight with nature itself. Their weapons were not rifles, but bulldozers, cranes, and dynamite. Each machine was precious. Every bolt and engine part carried thousands of miles across the Pacific. If one failed, there was no replacement. The men who operated them weren't typical soldiers. They were older, tougher, many in their 30s and 40s. They had built highways, dug tunnels, welded bridges. Now they wore Navy uniforms, but their hands still carried the scars of civilian labor. They landed with speed and fury. There was no time for hesitation. Within minutes of stepping onto the reef, surveyors were hammering stakes into coral. Bulldozer blades dropped, engines belching black smoke as they bit into the unforgiving stone. The first hours were chaos. Waves slammed into the reef, flooding work zones. Men cursed as coral tore their boots, drawing blood with every step. Saltwater rusted tools before the day was out. But the CBs pressed on. They had a deadline, and it was merciless, 48 hours. That was the window before Japanese bombers would inevitably discover them. A single scout plane could ruin everything. If Tokyo's war planners realized what was happening, they would send wave after wave of attacks. But until then, the reef was a secret battlefield, hidden under the roar of bulldozers. The CB's motto was simple: we build, we fight. They weren't meant to wait for perfect conditions. They were meant to improvise, to take the impossible and hammer it into submission, and that's exactly what they did. Explosives blasted ridges of coral into rubble. Bulldozers shoved the debris aside, flattening the surface. Steel matting, interlocking panels carried at great risk across the sea, was dragged into place. Each sheet turned a jagged reef into something smoother, something that might support a fighter's wheels. Every man worked with desperation. Sleep became an afterthought. Meals were skipped, eaten standing, shovels in hand. The reef itself seemed to resist them. But the CBs refused to stop. One officer wrote, "It wasn't just construction, it was combat." And the enemy was the reef. But far above, beyond the reach of their eyes, another enemy loomed. Japanese reconnaissance planes circled the Pacific skies. It was only a matter of time before silence broke. Day one was a blur of dust, sweat, and fear. By nightfall, a crude outline of the runway had taken shape. Men collapsed onto coral to rest, but only for an hour or two. The next shift hauled them back to their feet. The clock never stopped ticking. Floodlights powered by portable generators lit the reef, a beacon of activity in the dark. Engines roared through the night. Bulldozers scraped and clanked. Sparks flew from welding torches as crews repaired broken blades and worn-out parts. Sleep was a luxury none could afford. Every man knew if they failed, they would all die here. At dawn, the second day began, and with it came the first hint of disaster. A lookout spotted shapes on the horizon, specks in the sky growing larger. Japanese aircraft, hearts pounded. Was this the end? The bulldozers didn't stop. Men didn't run for cover. They kept working, betting everything on speed. If the Japanese saw only a barren reef, maybe they would ignore it. If they spotted bulldozers and men, the attack would come. The planes passed. High distant, never descending. The reef remained invisible. Luck had favored them, but it wouldn't hold forever. By midday, the airstrip stretched across hundreds of feet. Explosives shattered coral boulders. Teams drenched in sweat shoveled debris, their hands blistered and bleeding. Bulldozers spread gravel across the flattened strip, preparing the way for steel mats. Every man felt the weight of time pressing on him. Hours became weapons. Every delay, every breakdown was an enemy strike, and breakdowns came often. Bulldozers overheated. Fuel pumps clogged with salt water. Steel cables snapped under strain. With no spare parts, mechanics cannibalized one machine to keep another alive. Still, they pressed on. By the second night, exhaustion blurred vision. Men swayed as they worked, hallucinating from lack of sleep. Some collapsed where they stood, dragged aside so others could take their place. Yet the runway grew longer, smoother, closer to reality. Japanese planes appeared again at dawn. This time closer. The men froze, hearts hammering. One crew ducked into shallow trenches, praying the camouflage netting hid their bulldozer. The planes circled once, then turned away. Relief flooded the reef, but also terror. The secret was fragile. The Japanese would not stay blind forever. The CBs worked harder. Some men joked bitterly that the reef itself would kill them before the Japanese had the chance. But laughter was thin, broken by the roar of engines and the crash of waves. They had just hours left. The airstrip had to be finished. It wasn't simply construction anymore. It was survival. As one CB scrawled in his journal, we weren't building an airfield. We were building a miracle. For the Japanese high command, the Pacific was a chessboard. They believed they saw every move, every island, every lagoon, and to a degree they did. Their reconnaissance network stretched across thousands of miles. Their naval air arm ruled the skies, but even the sharpest eyes can go blind. The reef chosen by the Americans was a ghost on the Japanese map. Surveys had listed it as barren. Reports dismissed it as uninhabitable. Reconnaissance pilots flew over, glanced down, and saw only surf breaking against coral. Nothing more. That judgment was fatal. Japanese commanders assumed the Americans needed months, not hours, to build an airfield. They looked for construction on volcanic islands, jungled atolls, places where soil could support runways. A reef, that was impossible. To them, it was as absurd as planting wheat in the middle of the sea, and arrogance crept in. The victories of 1941 and 1942 had convinced many that the United States was clumsy, slow, unimaginative. They underestimated the CB's ingenuity. They could not imagine bulldozers carving coral day and night. They could not imagine steel mats covering waterlogged rock. In Tokyo's war rooms, the reef didn't exist as a threat. And that ignorance gave the CBs their most precious ally, time. Back on the reef, the men felt the pressure of that blindness. They knew every hour of Japanese delay was their gain. Every reconnaissance plane that passed without circling was a miracle. Still, danger loomed. Supplies ran low. Fuel barrels dropped faster than expected. Explosives dwindled. The bulldozers coughed smoke, threatening to die with every push. One officer admitted privately, if the Japanese had looked twice, they would have ended us. But they never looked twice. It was a rare, decisive blind spot in the war, and the Americans were ready to exploit it. The reef thundered through another night. Explosions lit the darkness. Men shouted over the roar of engines. By dawn, the skeleton of a runway stretched across the coral, jagged, rough, but unmistakable. The impossible was becoming real, but a skeleton wasn't enough. Planes needed a surface they could trust. Wheels couldn't land on sharp coral without shredding apart. Something smoother, stronger had to be laid down. The answer waited in stacks of heavy steel mats, thousands of interlocking panels. Dragged ashore by hand, hauled into place by bulldozers, hammered together under moonlight, piece by piece the reef transformed. Piece by piece, it became something the Japanese swore could never exist. 48 hours after the first bulldozer blade cut into coral, the reef no longer looked like nature's fortress. It looked like a weapon. The CBs had worked themselves to exhaustion, but they had done the unthinkable. A 3,000-foot runway stretched across the reef, lined with steel matting, smoothed as best as human hands could manage. It was crude, it was rough, but it was enough. On the second evening, as the sun bled into the Pacific horizon, the first American fighter taxied forward. Its engine thundered against the silence, echoing across the reef. CBs gathered, faces streaked with sweat and coral dust, too tired to cheer but too proud to stay away. The fighter picked up speed. Its wheels rattled across the steel mats, bouncing against the seams. For a heartbeat, men feared the strip would fail, that it would tear apart under pressure. Then the plane lifted into the air. Wings caught the wind. The fighter rose, circling once over the reef. The impossible airstrip had just birthed its first flight. The men erupted. Shouts, whistles, some dropped to their knees in relief. Others pounded each other's backs, laughing through tears. They had proven it could be done. They had turned water and stone into a base of war. One CB later wrote, "I had never seen grown men cry like that. We were too tired to celebrate, but in that moment, we knew we had beaten the reef and beaten the clock. The runway became more than just a strip of steel. It was a symbol, proof that American industry and ingenuity could bend even the harshest terrain to its will. Proof that no place in the Pacific was beyond reach, and for the Japanese, the revelation would be devastating. Reconnaissance flights soon returned. Pilots expected to see an empty reef. Instead, they saw the gleam of steel, the tracks of bulldozers and planes already taking off. Shock rippled through Japanese command. In less than 2 days, the Americans had created what they believed was impossible: a hidden fortress. A forward base. The reef that nobody wanted had become a dagger aimed at Japan's defenses. But this miracle came at a cost. Dozens of men collapsed from heatstroke and exhaustion. Engines were ruined, machines wrecked beyond repair. Supplies ran dangerously thin. And the Japanese, once blind, were now wide awake. The miracle runway had been built, but how long could it survive under enemy fire? When the first reconnaissance photos reached Japanese command, disbelief spread like wildfire. The reef, that worthless, empty scar of coral they had dismissed for months, now showed a gleaming strip. Aircraft parked along its edge, and fuel dumps rising in the background. How could the Americans do in 2 days what normally took months? Officers argued. Some claimed the photographs were doctored. Others insisted the base must have been under construction long before. The idea that bulldozers and steel mats had achieved this in 48 hours was too outrageous to accept. But reality didn't care what they believed. The runway was there, and American planes were already using it. The reaction was swift. Japanese bombers were dispatched, racing toward the reef with orders to erase the miracle airfield before it could change the balance of power. They came in waves, dropping bombs across the reef, sending geysers of seawater and fire into the sky. Seabees scattered into foxholes, clutching their rifles, though they were builders, not frontline soldiers. The runway shuddered under impact, mats twisted and torn, bulldozers flipped into the surf. But every time the smoke cleared, men crawled out and began again. Twisted mats were dragged back into place. Craters were filled with rubble. Steel plates were hammered flat. Bulldozers, patched with welding torches still hot from battle, rolled forward once more. The Japanese were stunned not only by the runway's sudden appearance, but by its refusal to die. Day after day, they attacked. Day after day, the Seabees rebuilt. And while the Japanese wasted bombs on the reef, American planes flew from its surface, intercepting patrols, escorting bombers, raiding enemy positions. What had been nothing more than coral and salt spray was now a forward dagger thrust into Japanese supply lines. One Japanese officer later admitted, "We had underestimated the enemy's ability to turn nature into a weapon. That was our mistake. We thought the reef was useless." The Americans thought differently. The reef had become a fortress, not of stone, but of will, and the Japanese knew the tide of the Pacific War had shifted another step against them. The miracle airstrip lasted far longer than anyone expected. Though bombed and battered, it kept serving its purpose: a forward base, a shield for convoys, a platform for attack. Every fighter that took off from its surface carried with it the spirit of the men who had built it in desperation and defiance. The legacy wasn't just strategic, it was symbolic. For the United States, the reef proved that no obstacle was too great, no terrain too hostile. The Seabees had shown that engineering and courage could achieve the impossible. They had turned a barren rock into a lifeline, reshaping not only maps but morale. For the Japanese, the reef was a haunting reminder. It forced them to confront a truth they had ignored. The enemy they mocked as clumsy and soft was resourceful, relentless, and capable of miracles under fire. The broader war surged on. Battles raged across the Solomon Islands, the Gilberts, the Marshalls. But everywhere American forces advanced, the lesson of the reef echoed. If there was no land, they would make land. If there was no runway, they would build one. And they would do it faster than anyone thought possible. The Seabees carried that reputation with them for the rest of the war. They blasted jungles into airstrips, carved harbors from coral, and raised bases where maps showed only emptiness. Their motto, "We build, we fight," was more than a phrase. It was a warning. By 1945, the miracle reef was one story among dozens, yet it remained unforgettable. To the men who were there, it was proof that victory sometimes began not with a battle, but with a bulldozer. Today, the reef still lies in the Pacific, waves crashing against its coral ridges. Most who pass by never know the secret it once held. They see only white surf and stone. But beneath those waters rests the memory of 48 hours when human will defy nature and war itself. It was a forgotten mission, hidden beneath the roar of greater battles, but in those 2 desperate days, history turned because what the Japanese dismissed as impossible became reality, and reality became a weapon. The Reef airstrip was only one of the Pacific's hidden miracles. Elsewhere, secret bases were carved into jungles, mountains, and caves, places the Japanese thought untouchable, and one of them would change the war even more dramatically.